This is Tipping Point Radio. I'm Craig Merriweather, and you're listening to The Mastermind Show. Happiness experts have long told us to tune out our negative emotions and focus instead on mindfulness, positivity, and optimism. While the authors of the book, The Upside of Your Darkside, disagree. Drawing upon extensive scientific research and a wide array of real-life examples, they show that positive emotions alone are not enough. Anger can make us creative, selfishness can make us brave, and guilt is a powerful motivator. The real key to success lies in emotional agility. Well, today on the Mastermind Show, I'm talking with one of the authors of that book, Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener. Robert is widely known as the Indiana Jones of psychology because his research on social psychology has taken him to far-flung places as Greenland, India, Kenya, and Israel. He has conducted studies with the Amish, the Maasai tribal people, sex workers, seal hunters living near the North Pole, and a variety of other groups traditionally overlooked by psychologists. Robert is a leading authority on strengths, culture, courage, and happiness, and has published dozens of scholarly articles on these topics. He sits on the editorial boards of the Journal of Positive Psychology and the Journal of Happiness Studies. Robert is also the foremost authority on positive psychology coaching and has consulted with a wide range of international organizations on performance management and leadership development. He is managing director of Positive Acorn, a Portland-based consultancy with programs in coaching, positive education, and strengths-based management. Each year, Robert trains thousands of professionals in dozens of countries to use positive psychology in their work. He has also written a number of books, including Happiness, Unlocking the Mysteries of Psychological Wealth, The Courage Quotient, and The Upside of Your Dark Side. And now here's my interview with Dr. Robert Biswas-Diener. Hello, Robert. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I think your book is one of the more fascinating and important ones that I've seen this year, because you're taking a whole new, different look at what it means to be happy, or what it means to live the good life. I think so many of us are trying to stuff down our quote unquote negative emotions, anger, anxiety, or depression, sadness, grief. And your book basically says that's the wrong way to go. And, in fact, one of your sub titles for one of your chapters is why the way we've been pursuing happiness is not going to make us happy. And so this is a very broad question. What have we been doing wrong, and why are we still not happy?
It's a good question. It's sort of the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? Yeah. So let me first sort of throw a bone to the idea that many people are happy, and we're not getting happiness all wrong. I don't think the sky is falling, and I don't want to pretend that we're totally off course. I do think that people have generally good instincts towards happiness. They make lots of decisions that they think will make them happier, whether that's pursuing a university degree, marrying a particular person, or retiring to a specific city. Sometimes these things work out for us. Occasionally they don't. But I do think that people kind of have an intuitive grasp for happiness. I think where we get it wrong is by thinking that there's no place in the world of the good life for these negative emotions or for negative experiences. And the truth is, you just can't avoid them. Sometimes someone's going to steal your parking spot or say something rude to you. Sometimes you're going to just sort of feel blue for no reason one afternoon. And rather than trying to just stuff these down or pretend they don't exist, or even worse, sort of whitewash them into amazing learning experiences or something overly positive, I think we can just accept them for what they are. Without having to fight against them.
All right, but a lot of us we strive. We're pursuing that happiness, and even that word "pursuing." I was thinking about that today. It seems like that even has a ring of desperateness about it. The police are pursuing the criminal. We are pursuing happiness, and it seems. We so badly don't want to feel these emotions that we try to push them away or stuff them down.
Well, absolutely. So, first, you're right. We are pursuing happiness, and I think we're doing so because, again, our instincts tell us that it's a worthwhile experience. It certainly feels good to be happy, so there's a rationale for pursuing it right there. But it turns out that happiness is pretty good for you. It seems to give you a minor boost to your immune system. It makes you a little bit more sociable, a little bit more playful and creative. So there's a bunch of pretty solid reasons, I think, to pursue happiness. I think the mistake then is in thinking that you can just sort of cross the finish line and then just be in this eternal state called happiness. And in thinking that life must only include the pleasurable moments and that the painful moments aren't part of that same pursuit or aren't part of that same process as well. And I think increasingly we're becoming less comfortable with those sort of icky feelings, for lack of a better word. And as we become more divorced from them, they're seen as increasingly toxic to us.
Well, yeah, and I think that's what we're trying to avoid. After a while, we just get tired of feeling like that, and we don't want to feel like that anymore.
Absolutely, and one of the things I think is so interesting is that in modern times, we actually can avoid them pretty well. We have more technology available to us to avoid hardship than any time in history. I don't entirely know what it would be like to be, let's say, a medieval farmer, but I imagine that life was harder than the life I experience today. If I, on the physical level, feel uncomfortable with the temperature, I can basically flick a switch and just fix that problem. If I feel stressed out about work, I can uncork a bottle of wine, I can flip on the TV. I have a wide range of entertainment options. I have instantaneous communication. I really don't have to be bored or frustrated by wait times all that longer anymore. And I think that you actually see this cropping up. I mean, when people tell their harrowing stories of their vacation gone awry, they say things like, well, our plane was delayed and we missed our flight. And that somehow has become this major source of drama for the middle class. And I think as we increasingly avoid those states, we just sort of get out of practice in dealing with them. I think 30 years ago even, people just sort of understood that sometimes you miss a flight, sometimes you're delayed, and they were just a little bit better psychologically able to take those kinds of minor hardships in stride.
Yeah, and a lot of these entertainment options that we have, or texting or Facebook, it seems more of a instead of making us happy, we're trying to cover up and ignore, the anger and the grief and the sadness in our lives. Rather than dealing with the sadness, we're just trying to cover it up with massive amounts of entertainment options and going out to the bar with friends and things. And that doesn't seem that healthy,
Yeah, this is when I started reviewing some of the emotion research in preparation to write this book. One of the studies that I was most struck by was a study that looked at clinically depressed people who hail from Asian cultures versus clinically depressed people who come from the United States. And in both cases, they're depressed. So you just think to yourself, oh, well, they must all be sad and they must all sort of react in the same way. But it turns out there were some important differences. When the researcher showed a little clip of a comedy movie to them, the Asians were more likely to laugh at it. And then when they showed them a dramatic, sort of heart-wrenching movie to both groups, the Asians were more likely to cry at it. And this is interesting because what it suggests is that for this, at least in the sample of clinically depressed people from Asia, they were more likely to express and experience all of the emotions. That is, happiness, sadness, all of it. And the American sample, by contrast, spent so much time trying to just push down all of the emotions, just suppress everything. And suppression is sort of a blunt instrument. So you can't just choose to suppress guilt but not suppress happiness. You just sort of blunt everything. And so the Americans who were struggling so mightily to push down their sadness were sort of pushing down everything along the way.
Well, that's interesting because in part of your book, you discuss how anger and sadness signals that something has significance for it. So this is an important thing to maybe take a look at, but we're trying to ignore it because we don't want to feel the feelings.
Absolutely. And I think to some extent this can be a little bit of a bitter pill for some people to swallow. And that's the idea that emotions are a little bit better than people give them credit for. I think there's a lot of people that sort of harbor this sort of antiquated view of emotion, that emotions are somehow traditionally feminine, that when you're emotional, you're out of control of yourself. Emotions represent our more animalistic parts of our nature, and it's our reason that's really what separates humans from other animals. But I think that we have pretty good understanding that emotions really are functional, all emotions, that they sort of act like a radar tracking system that gives us a little bit of a mental thumbs up or thumbs down about the events of our life. So in the cases you just mentioned, if you feel a little spike of anger or irritation, it's just a signal telling you that you're perceiving a threat to something that you value. That might be your property, it might be your person, it might be someone you care about or your ideas. But it's kind of preparing you for action to defend yourself against that threat. Same thing. Sadness is telling you that things aren't going well and that you should call a timeout and quit expending energy and resources, which is why people who experience sadness sort of have this freeze mentality, why they're just sitting on the couch. They're not using too many of their resources where they might not be effectively deployed. And all the emotions are like this. Guilt tells you violated your moral code. Fear tells you that there's a danger. So even though they're not pleasant to experience, they can be quite useful to pay attention to.
Well, one of the sentences in your book that really struck me was this one, and you write, people who are comfortable with both positive and negative emotional states and can draw from the full range of human emotions are the healthiest and often the most successful. And I found that eyebrow-raising because, I can see how by not stuffing your emotions you become healthy, but what is it about being comfortable with positive and negative emotions that makes you successful?
Well, if you have that kind of flexibility, that mental flexibility where you're able to validly experience your own anger, and I'm not talking about lashing out at people or injuring others, but simply to be angry and to understand and recognize what that signals, why that anger is coming about, what it might be telling you. That's going to be helpful, and it's going to help you navigate some circumstances. I always tell people, for example, you want to be able to feel fear if you're walking across a dark parking lot alone at night. You want the hairs on your neck to be able to stand up. You want to be a little bit more vigilant, a little more cautious. And that fear is going to help you be successful. You don't want to be stuck in that mode where you're afraid to do anything, but you want to be able to appropriately feel and use that fear. And the same thing, worry, for example. People think that stress is epidemic these days, that people are worried. Sometimes we're worried over nothing. But occasionally you want people to be able to worry. I always say that I would rather have the person who's directing air traffic control at my airport, I want them to be a little bit of a worrier. I don't want them to sort of have a close enough or good enough attitude. I want them to be focused on what might go wrong.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of a study that I read a little bit about. Didn't go in depth, but it said that pessimists have a longer lifespan, and the reason is because they worry and they don't walk across the street and optimistically think the bus is going to stop in time, and so. Yeah, that fear of walking through a dark parking lot puts you on edge and gets your adrenaline going and keeps you alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the same token, we don't want people to be paralyzed with fright or only pessimistic. No one would ever be an entrepreneur, open a business, or take a risk, or invest in something if they were only pessimistic. So optimism serves its function, and really that's, I think, at the heart of the book. The idea that we're not trying to dismiss happiness or optimism, nor are we saying that negative emotions are the only good emotions, but rather the flexibility to shift between them and to experience everything is really what makes you whole and successful.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I like on your website, which, by the way, everybody listening, is intentionalhappiness.com, which is a great URL. But your kind of little motto or slogan on there is the science of the good life. And I was just wondering, why is tolerating pain and dealing with these negative emotions so important to living a good life? Why can't we just ignore them, make them go away by reading all these positive self-help books and just be happy all the time?
Sure. Well, it's become en vogue to talk about failure as a great learning experience and to talk about hardship as a great learning experience. And I do believe that, but I also believe that can be trumped up, and it can sound a little bit like a positive whitewash of real life. And sometimes painful experiences are just that. They're painful, and we don't need to rush to talk about how fortunate we are to experience them. Having said all of that, I think that some of your most treasured moments and memories are from hardships. And I'm not talking about the death of a spouse or death of a child, because I think those are punches to the stomach that knock virtually everyone down when they experience them. But if you just think about something like the opportunity to take a vacation overseas, what a rich and rewarding experience that is. But going in that it is going to be an uncomfortable experience. The travel itself is difficult. Navigating a culture where you don't speak the language is a bit awkward. You might feel self-conscious about your lack of understanding how cultural norms work. You might physically get lost in the new city. And despite all of that hardship, when you repackage those experiences in memory, you feel more growth, you feel more competency, and you feel just the excitement of the novelty of all of it.
I'm wondering if being an introvert and extrovert has anything to do with how one deals with the negative emotions. My wife and I are kind of going through this at the moment as she's discovering. I'm an introvert. She's very much an extrovert, and she's been reading this book about introverts, and I'm finally kind of understanding why I do the things I do, and need time to process and need time to be on my own. And I'm wondering if, in terms of being successful in dealing with negative emotions, if introverts have a easier time with it, or maybe extroverts have an easier time with it, if that's even a thing.
Sure. Well, I think it's a great question. I also recognize the potential trap I'm walking into. I certainly don't want to be the final arbiter of a marital dispute between you and your wife. I very much hope the book is Quiet by Susan Cain.
That's the one she's reading.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book, and I would recommend it to any of your listeners. I think whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it's a great read. But in it, I think Susan makes a really, really great argument for the way that introverts process things. We just happen to have set up society in a very pro-extroversion kind of way. If you look at the happiness research related to extroversion, extroverts do seem to be a little bit happier, but it could be that extroverts seek out pleasurable experiences more, and that's one of their distinguishing features. We always think about extroverts as being people who are just more sociable, but it could be that social connection happens to be pleasurable. So really, extroverts are just reward seekers. They want pleasure, and being sociable happens to be part and parcel of that. So I do think that what you're suggesting has a little bit of credence. I think we would need to research it more, but the introverts maybe have sort of a more natural leaning towards all emotions, and may, in fact, on average, be better to sort of suffer those mild dark states than are their more extroverted counterparts.
Yeah, and it's not that we're having marital turmoil. It's just fascinating to watch this process of kind of getting to know each other. Again, not that we didn't know each other, but it's, as now she's understanding why I quote unquote can be moody, and it was, there's science behind it. There's an explanation behind it, but getting back to what you were saying just then, I'm wondering then, should we spend the time to pursue happiness? If you're not happy, if you're having a hard time, is it wise and healthy to go out and seek social interaction to create happiness, or go to our comfort areas of entertainment, or if we want to read books or walk in nature? Do we pursue that if we're not comfortable with the negative emotions?
Yeah, so I give a very qualified yes, because happiness does seem to be somewhat beneficial for us, as I mentioned, with boosts to the immune system and so forth. And happiness gives you a little bit of energy, just a little bit of confidence. It allows you to go about your daily living. So I think it is a desirable state. I don't think it's the only state we should be pursuing. Sometimes we pursue novelty, even though we know that it'll be less comfortable and more anxiety producing. Sometimes we pursue trust or connection, even though those might not necessarily carry with them any feeling of happiness. So happiness is just one among many worthwhile goals. But I think where people really go off the rails is when they put too much stock in happiness, when they start thinking that happiness is something that you need to almost stockpile in the way that some people might feel like stockpiling money. And when they do that with money, we call it greed. But there might be sort of a happiness version of that too, where they think no matter how happy I am, I can always be happier. I can always be more sustainably happy. Anytime I'm not happy, that's akin to failure. And I think that's where people get into trouble. And in fact, we find that when people put such a high premium on happiness, they end up reporting feeling a little bit lonelier, and ironically, often a little bit more dissatisfied, because they're kind of putting this perfectionistic lens on the pursuit of happiness.
Well, okay, then, so how do we increase our threshold for pain or negative emotions? Is that something we need to work on, actually figuring out a way to be comfortable with these emotions?
Yeah, it is something that you certainly can work on. Much of our leanings around emotions, what we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with, are taught to us. That is, we're socialized as to what to feel and when. A perfect, easy to understand example of this is the way that young boys are socialized not to express sadness or to cry when they're hurt. It's not that boys somehow biologically lack tear ducts or the ability to cry, but we often socialize this expression of sadness or pain out of them. So it's clear that at least in some cases you can learn an emotional leaning, if you will. And I think that you can learn to accept and I'm going to use the word tolerate some of these negative experiences. And I think just like building your muscles at the gym, you start by doing it in short bursts, you do it frequently, you make it a habit, and ultimately you build up from your 1 mile run metaphorically to your marathon. So some of it is just actually sitting with your emotion. If you feel a little frustrated or a little bored, not trying to rescue yourself from that. Not just picking up your smartphone or texting someone, but actually just allowing yourself to experience the boredom, if even for 5 minutes. And I think a great place to practice this is whenever we're alone. You may notice you go to dinner with a friend and they excuse themselves to go to the restroom. You immediately feel like reaching for your phone. You're standing in line at the bank. It's going to be 2 minutes. You immediately feel a pull of your phone. So that, for many people, is a wonderful opportunity to just sit back and say, hey, what would it be like to ignore the gravitational pull of my phone and just sit with whatever it is I'm feeling, because I can definitely tolerate 2 minutes of fear or boredom or guilt or sadness or whatever it is I'm experiencing. I think that's a great place to start.
Well, where does that come from? Because really, cell phones are only a handful of years old. What were we doing before cell phones? Were we tolerating the boredom and the frustration and loneliness?
I think often in those types of situations, we would just allow our own thoughts to accompany us, or daydream, or things like that. And you can see this in terms of wait times. Our tolerance for wait times is going down. Again, referring back to what life must have been like as a medieval farmer, I'm sure loads of folks would walk days to take their produce to market. And a several-day walk would seem quite normal in their circumstance. I think that if you look back as recently as, let's say, World War II, the idea that people had to wait in long lines for things was sort of taken in stride. It wasn't pleasurable, but it was understandable. But now I think, 15 minutes seems unbearable, and then 5 minutes, and if you're waiting for a text, even a handful of seconds can seem too long.
Well, let's talk about the M word, mindfulness, because it seems like this is getting towards mindfulness, and that's kind of the hip catch thing to be doing. All the magazines are talking about. There's even a magazine called Mindfulness. Lots of books about it, lots of articles about it. It sounds like, we're getting into being mindful of these emotions, and is that a healthy thing to be doing, this mindfulness thing?
In general, I'm going to say, again, yes, and it's a qualified yes. I think the popularity of mindfulness, which is something that originally came out of Buddhism and Eastern religious traditions, really in modern times simply means just noticing the world around you, or noticing your internal experience without a whole lot of judgment or internal storytelling. The way that you might fight with your spouse, and then once the fight is over, continue to replay versions of it in your head where you say a clever thing or you're victorious, even though the fight is long since past. That's all just happening in your head. And I think the mindful approach would say, let all that go. Just pay attention to what's actually truly happening right here, right now, and you'll feel a little bit better about that. So mindfulness is a good way to start tolerating those emotions, just to say, okay, I feel angry. This is what it feels like in my body. I'm noticing it. I don't feel guilty for feeling angry. I'm not afraid of feeling angry. I'm just noticing how it is. But like anything, I think mindfulness can be taken too far. That is, we don't want to just constantly be mindful at every single moment. There are really wonderful reasons to be mindless as well. Mind wandering, daydreaming are wonderful fonts of creativity for us. So I think, again, flexibility is the answer, the ability to shift between mindfulness most of the time and mindlessness occasionally is what we're shooting for.
Okay. Well, the book we're talking about is The Upside of Your Darkside. You can find this at your local bookstore, or, of course, get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. In dealing with our dark side, how do we deal, if we're uncomfortable with the feelings, how can we deal with the negative feelings that come up during the day? If we got a work situation, we have a relationship situation, these negative emotions are coming up, how do we get to a point where we're comfortable with them?
Sure. So I think in part understanding what these feelings are doing, that is, what their functions are. You probably don't hate the tires on your car or the steering wheel on your car because you understand that it serves a certain purpose. Your emotions are just the same way. Frustration just signals you that there's an obstacle to some goal that you value. Boredom is telling you that you're not receiving enough novelty or challenge for the amount of skill that you have. So just understanding that they're useful can be helpful. Then next, simply sitting with them for short periods of time and experiencing them and realizing that you can, in fact, tolerate them. People sometimes act as if these emotions are intolerable, but of course they're inside you, and you can easily tolerate it. It might be unpleasant, but nothing about being angry is intolerable to you. It is you. You're just angry. So those are two preliminary methods, and then I think learning what your own amount of comfort in the expression of those emotions is. And I think this is the tricky part for many people. For people, for example, who really hate anger and think it's inappropriate, it's often because they are thinking about the expressions of anger, things like violence or aggressive or abusive speech. But of course, that's not the same thing as anger. That's something that might potentially flow from anger. So understanding that your anger is just a feeling, but then what do you do with that feeling? And thinking about what is appropriate in your workplace. How do you give voice to your anger? Are you angry enough that it's worth giving voice to? Can you give voice to it right then in the moment when you're angry, or is there a strategic reason to put your thoughts on hold, and when you're no longer angry, go and talk to the person who's the focus of your anger? So really separating what the feeling is from how you express the feeling, I think, is a big trick.
Yeah. One question I had it's might be splitting hairs, but I was wondering, is there a difference between happiness and pleasure?
I think it's a great question. To some extent, it may be splitting hairs. Pleasure can be seen as sort of physiological, right? You slip into a bubble bath, and that's pleasurable. That is, you have these receptors in your skin, your muscles relax, that just physiologically it feels good to you. And that happens to be a very close cousin to emotional pleasure. The idea of getting a compliment and kind of feeling swollen with pride, puffed up a little bit, and puts a little smile on your face and spring in your step. Those things are all very much related, even biologically. They're activating the same places in your brain. So pleasure is part of happiness. I think it would be strange to talk about happiness as if it had nothing to do with pleasure, or if it was not pleasurable. But happiness often means something a little bit broader than simple day-to-day pleasures like eating chocolates. When we think about happiness, we often think about a sense of purpose or meaning in life as well, a sense that you're satisfied with the various aspects of your life, that your relationships are going well, that you feel comfortable with your own identity, you like yourself. So all of these might be aspects to this broader concept of happiness.
Well, the concept even gets a little more in depth, because in your book you describe wholeness, and what we should be striving for, if I can put words in your mouth, is we should be striving for this wholeness as opposed to happiness. And I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah, so that's exactly I think the take home, which is when we talk about feeling happy, whether you describe happiness as a sense of meaning in life or a sense of pleasure in life, you're really only talking about one portion of the human experience. And I think for most people, we want the capacity to be surprised. We want the capacity to be shocked even. We sometimes go to a titillating movie or a horror movie because of the thrill involved. We want the capacity to move out of our comfort zone, to experience novelty. We're willing to accept the frustration of trying to learn a second language because we know that that short-term hardship will be related to some longer-term gain. And when you start thinking about all of those things, that we don't just want meaning and pleasure, but we sort of want all of it, and we want the ability to shift between all of those states, you need a name for it, and my co-author and I just happen to call that wholeness. And we do see it as distinct from happiness, although it certainly includes happiness, but it's far broader because it includes all of your psychological architecture.
Right, because, like you were saying earlier, it's, feeling these emotions instead of stuffing them down can make you healthier and even more successful. Make you whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
So earlier you had mentioned that, oftentimes we rerun arguments in our head. We try to come up with a perfect comeback after we do that. And this might be, 9 times out of 10 we have a wonderful experience during a day, but it's that 10th thing that we process over and over and over again, trying to figure out how we could make it better, make it right. If we feel we've been trumped, and, how we can get the upper hand. Why is that? Why, if we had 9 things that went well and good and lots of compliments, why are we focusing on this one thing that didn't go well?
It's a really wonderful question. So there are a couple of pretty fundamental psychological processes that happen in us. And we have a bias for negativity. That is, negative events sort of loom larger in our consciousness. They pull more of our attention. And if you think about it, this can be related back to evolution. The cost of getting it wrong where negatives are concerned are much worse than getting it wrong where positives are concerned. So if you walk by your hose coiled on the ground and you think it might be a snake, you jump back, and it's better to err on the side of it being a snake than just assuming that it's a hose. So we're actually a little bit hardwired to sort of view snakes out there, as it were. So when things go wrong, when our relationships are off kilter, when we've experienced a failure at work, when someone is threatening to us, those are all problems that are pulling for our attention. And those weigh a lot more than the positives. So, a very easy way to understand this is you can give your wife 2 compliments, and you can give her 2, kind of rude, statements about her, and those will not counteract each other. You need a whole lot more compliments to sort of counterbalance the negative, and that's the exact same way that all of those negative emotional experiences are for us.
Well, everybody, I want to let you know that we're talking about Robert's book, The Upside of Your Darkside. If you want more information about Robert, you can go to his website, which is intentionalhappiness.com. And a couple more, I don't know if they're quick questions, but I think they're important from your book about how to deal with these negative emotions that come up. One, I think that everybody can maybe knows and feels maybe on a fairly consistent basis is anger, whether it's at family issues or work issues. And you say focus on the behavior and not the person who caused the problem. And I'm wondering how, in the kind of midst of dealing with anger or being upset, we can start doing these little exercises to maybe not make a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a wide range of sort of techniques, I suppose you could call them, that you can use. Some of them won't sound like rocket science to your listeners, but little things like sometimes when we're angry, we lash out at the person. That's where you say a hurtful word that you regret later. And the reason we do that isn't because we're suddenly all evil people, but because it's a great way to sort of push the person back, to put them on the defensive and to remove the threat to ourselves. But ultimately, there's a price you pay, especially if you hurt your friend or your romantic partner with a hurtful word. So what you really want to do is really try and focus on the situation, on the behavior, rather than on the person themselves. So just making that distinction, I think, can potentially be helpful to you, and also making the decision about, do I need to engage with this anger right now? Or can I take a break? That is, do we need to have a fight right this second just because I feel angry? Or can I just go be angry by myself in the other room? And I think that's a little bit different than how many people think about it, which is, what can I do to quit being angry? Either I'm going to vent my anger and get it out, or I'm going to go distract myself and try and get rid of it. But the truth is, the anger will go away by itself as long as you're not up in your head continuing to tell stories that create more and more anger.
Right. Well, one of the other things that was actually kind of eye-opening for me was the benefits of delaying gratification. It seems like, well, if I'm looking for pleasure, I'm looking for happiness, this thing is going to, bring me some joy in my life. Why would I wait till tomorrow to maybe do it or acquire it or whatever? What's the benefits of delaying gratification?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is one of the ways that you can sort of flex those muscles and begin to tolerate some of those harder emotional states. And I think that it's especially important in our raising of children, for example, that sometimes kids don't get what they want, and that allows them over time to build better self-control. That is, they're able to handle disappointment and bounce back, and they're able to set longer-term goals without always putting the short-term reward in front of a longer-term payoff. And we want the same thing for adults. Just because we've grown up doesn't mean that we should quit doing those things that are so helpful for kids. If we only shoot for short-term payoffs, we're never going to achieve our long-term success.
Right. Well, and then that's the thing. And we get back to wholeness, as you were talking about. If we, I'm wondering, to kind of wrap this up because we're hitting the top of the clock, whether there's like something we can do on a daily basis. Maybe before we walk into the office, maybe before we walk back into our home after a crappy day at work, to like get ourselves into more of a wholeness state than focusing on the anger or the irritation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that people either go with I'm going to vent my awful day at work. That is, I'm going to come home and complain about it. But oftentimes this just serves to continue it, because really you're just riling yourself up emotionally and telling a story about how you were the victim and your awful supervisor said something so mean to you, and you're looking for social support from the people you're telling the story to. So the venting is sort of the one thing, or the distracting, flip on the TV as soon as I get home. And neither of those really help you to transition in terms of your psychological state. So if there is 60 seconds that you can take in the car and just sort of say, how is it that I feel? Can I label my feeling right now? Can I just sit with that feeling without trying to avoid it or promote it? And then I'm going to walk into my house, and when I'm in my house, that's not work. There isn't a mean supervisor there. And I'm just going to start thinking about, how do I feel now seeing my partner, my children, or whoever it is who's there.
Well, that's what, and I think the most important thing is actually taking the time to do it. And, we seem so over busy nowadays that taking just even a handful of minutes to, check in with where we are, and, realizing that these are emotions, and, we don't have to, come home and complain and whine or go to work in a bad mood. Robert, I so appreciate you taking time to talk about the book, The Upside of Your Dark Side. I think it's really important. It starts an amazing conversation about what it is to be happy and what it is to ignore the quote-unquote negative emotions and maybe ignore them to our detriment. So anyway, the website is intentionalhappiness.com. You can go find out more about Robert there and find his book at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstore, The Upside of Your Dark Side. It's an amazing read. And Robert, thank you so much for being here today.
It was an honor being here. Thank you so much.